I will never forget the day I discovered what Bigfoot does with human bodies. A discovery that haunts my dreams every night when I close my eyes, that forever changed my understanding of the natural world and the creatures we share this planet with. Something no human being should ever have to witness. I'm 57 years old now, and as an evolutionary biologist who spent 3 decades studying the behavior patterns of great apes, I thought I was prepared for any scientific discovery. But nothing, absolutely nothing in my academic training or field experience could have prepared me for the horror and, paradoxically, the strange reverence I felt when I uncovered the hidden truth deep within the Olympic National Forest. My name is Dr. Thomas Hargrove, and for most of my career, I've worked at respectable institutions: Harvard, National Geographic, the Smithsonian, cataloging and studying the behavior of great apes in their natural habitats. I spent 7 years in the forests of Central Africa studying gorillas, 5 years in Borneo with orangutans, and even worked as a consultant for conservation organizations worldwide. My academic papers were frequently cited, my books on primate ethology praised by colleagues. I was, by all conventional standards, a respected scientist. But all of that ended when I began pursuing what the scientific community considers a myth, a legend, a fantasy: Sasquatch, or as it's more popularly known, Bigfoot. My obsession began as many scientific obsessions do, with an anomalous data point, an observation that didn't fit the accepted paradigm. In 2018, I was doing routine fieldwork in the Pacific Northwest forests, documenting movement patterns of brown bears using trail cameras. It was a simple project, nothing extraordinary about it. Until, on a cold October morning, while checking the footage captured overnight, I saw something I couldn't explain. It was 5:17 in the morning when I began reviewing the footage from that particular camera, positioned near a creek about 7 miles deep into the forest. I was sipping my coffee, still groggy, inside the small research cabin I was renting on the outskirts of Olympic National Park. The aroma of black coffee mingled with the smell of damp wood and wet soil drifting through the partially open window. The air was cold, and the morning mist covered the trees like a ghostly blanket. It was the perfect setting for what I was about to discover. In the video, captured around 2 a.m. under the camera's infrared light, a massive form moved fluidly between the trees. My first thought, of course, was bear, but something was profoundly wrong with that movement. Bears, even when moving quickly, have a distinctive cadence, a characteristic sway. This creature moved differently, erect, bipedal, with a fluid gait that seemed almost human. I froze the image on the clearest frame and zoomed in. The figure was at least 8 feet tall, massive, covered completely in thick, dark hair. Its arms were disproportionately long, swinging with an unsettling naturalness. But it was the face that made me spill hot coffee into my lap. A distinctly non-human face, but undeniably primate. It wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a human in a suit. It was something other. For years, I had dismissed Bigfoot stories as folklore, elaborate hoaxes, or misidentifications of known animals. As a scientist, I needed evidence, data, proof. And now, trembling as I wiped coffee from my field pants, I had something. It wasn't conclusive. A low-resolution video never would be, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in my scientific skepticism. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, at least not immediately. Instead, in the months that followed, I reconfigured my study. I installed more cameras, in locations strategically chosen based on historical reports of sightings. I began studying footprints I would have previously dismissed as belonging to bears or elk. I started listening, truly listening, to the stories told by local forest rangers and native residents. Stories I would have previously politely tolerated while internally dismissing. Now I was desperate for every fragment of information. The change in me didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues began questioning my methodology, my focus. Emails from academic departments received increasingly delayed responses. When funding for my official bear study was renewed, I found myself using resources and time for an unsanctioned parallel investigation. It was unethical, I knew, but something inside me had shifted. An obsessive need to know, to understand, had taken hold. It was in July 2019, almost 9 months after that first video sighting, that I had my second encounter, and this one was much more intimate. I was following what I believed to be a pattern of movement based on the rare video captures I'd managed and reports from forest rangers about broken trees and ground disturbances. The theory I was developing suggested these creatures, for I now believed there was more than one, followed specific seasonal routes likely related to food sources. The day was unusually warm for the region, the sun filtering through the forest canopy, creating dancing patterns of light on the moss-covered forest floor. The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the thick vegetation, and the aroma of pine trees and damp earth filled the air. The forest was quiet, unnervingly quiet, as it often becomes when a predator is nearby. That's when I noticed it. Not a sound, but the absence of it. I stopped, letting my equipment pack slowly slide to the ground. A few yards ahead of me, something had altered the vegetation. Leaves turned upward, revealing their lighter undersides, branches broken not by winds or storms, but with twists that only strong hands could make. And then, the smell. A mixture of animal musk, wet earth, and something almost fermented. That's when I sensed it before I even saw it. A presence. That primal, instinctive feeling that tells you you're not alone, that eyes are watching. I turned slowly, making no sudden movements, and there it was, partially hidden behind a massive redwood, observing me with surprisingly expressive eyes. It was immense, larger and more robust than any description or footage had suggested. Dark, almost black hair covered its body, slightly longer around the shoulders and head. The face was a disconcerting blend of features, a sagittal crest like that of an adult gorilla, prominent brow ridges, a broad, flat nose, but with a more vertical forehead than any known great ape, and the eyes. Deeply dark, yet unmistakably intelligent. This wasn't the gaze of an animal watching a potential predator or prey. It was the gaze of a being that was assessing, considering. Time seemed to freeze. My scientific training told me to grab my camera, document, obtain proof. But something deeper, perhaps that same primal intuition that alerts us to predators, told me to remain absolutely still. Not out of fear, though fear was certainly present, but out of respect. This wasn't a predator-prey relationship. It was an encounter between two conscious species, a mutual recognition. How long we stood like that, observing each other, I'm not certain. It could have been seconds or minutes. Then, with a movement surprisingly agile for something so massive, it moved. Not toward me, not away, but to the side, almost as if inviting me to follow. After a few steps, it stopped and looked back, as if checking whether I had understood the gesture. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was madness, that I should maintain distance, photograph from afar, be the objective observer I was trained to be. But the part of me that had been searching for this for almost a year now was in control. Slowly, deliberately, I began to follow, keeping a respectful distance. He, and it was definitely a male, judging by the size and structure, led me deeper into the forest. We moved in silence, except for the occasional snap of twigs beneath my feet. He, on the other hand, moved with a silent grace that defied his mass. The route seemed random at first, but I soon realized we were following an almost imperceptible path. Small marks on trees, configurations of rocks that seemed intentionally placed. Signs I never would have noticed had I not been following this being who clearly knew these forests intimately. After what I calculated to be about a mile, the forest began to change. The trees here were older, more massive, their trunks covered with thick moss and hanging lichens. Light filtered differently, creating an almost ethereal quality, like being inside a living cathedral. The air changed too, more humid, with a slight metallic odor I couldn't identify. That's when he stopped and did something that still makes me question my own memory. He turned fully toward me and made a deliberate gesture, His massive hand, with surprisingly long, articulated fingers, pointing to the ground and then to me. The meaning was clear: stay here. Then he disappeared among the trees with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for a creature of that size. I remained where I was, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Adrenaline coursed through my body, sharpening my senses. Minutes passed, and I began to wonder if that had been his intention all along, to lead me away, disorient me, and then abandon me. But something told me there was more to that gesture, more to that look. There was communication, intention. Approximately 20 minutes later, I heard movement again, not from the same location where he had disappeared, but from a different direction. And then, a sight that made me doubt my sanity. 3 figures emerged from the dense vegetation. The male I had followed, a slightly smaller figure, presumably a female, and between them, something that made my stomach twist and my academic mind collapse. A youngster, perhaps a third of the adult's height, looking at me with a curiosity that mirrored my own. A family of creatures that science said didn't exist. The female seemed more cautious, keeping the young one close to her, but the male stepped forward a few paces toward me and then sat back on his haunches in a fluid movement, almost like an invitation. After a moment's hesitation, I sat down too, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. Slowly, the female and the young one approached as well, sitting at a slightly greater distance. What occurred over the next 2 hours was the most extraordinary experience of my professional life. There was no verbal communication, at least not in the human sense of words and phrases, but there was undeniably communication. Gestures, facial expressions, small sounds that seemed loaded with meaning. The young one was particularly expressive, occasionally making movements toward me before the mother gently restrained it. At one point, I took an apple from my pack, a snack I'd brought for the excursion. Slowly, I showed it to the group before taking a bite, then offered it by extending my hand. The male looked at the fruit, then at me, and then, in a movement that left me breathless, extended his massive hand and carefully took the apple, examining it before smelling it and finally taking a bite. The sun began to set, and I realized I needed to return. I tried to communicate this through gestures, pointing to the descending sun and then in the general direction from which we had come. The male seemed to understand, rising to his full impressive height. But before I could move, he did something that still moves me when I recall it. He broke a small branch from a nearby tree, offering it to me. Was it a gesture of farewell? A symbol? A gift? I'll never know for certain, but I accepted the branch with the same reverence with which it was offered. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the 3 figures disappeared into the increasingly dark forest. In the weeks that followed, I returned to that area several times, but there were no more direct encounters. Occasionally, I would find signs, branches broken in specific lays, small piles of fruits or nuts left in places where I had stopped to rest, as if they were offerings or reciprocations for the shared apple. I began to realize I wasn't studying these creatures. We were studying each other with mutual curiosity. It was 2 months after this encounter that my research took a darker turn, leading me to the discovery that still haunts me. October had arrived again, bringing with it persistent rain and lower temperatures. The forests were quieter, many animals already preparing for winter. I had noticed a change in the patterns I had been observing. Fewer signs, fewer gifts, less evidence of passage in the areas I regularly frequented. Initially, I attributed this to seasonal change, assuming the creatures, I had begun calling them forest people in my private notes, were moving to more sheltered areas or following food sources. But then, on a particularly rainy afternoon, I found something disturbing. Marks on the ground that suggested a violent confrontation. Vegetation crushed in a circular pattern, soil turned over, and more alarming, blood. Not much, but enough to be noticeable, staining fallen leaves and spattering the trunk of a nearby tree. My first thought was hunters. Although we were within the boundaries of the national park, illegal hunting was not uncommon, especially in more remote areas. But something about the scene seemed wrong for a typical hunt. There were no vehicle marks, no spent ammunition casings, none of the characteristic tracks of carcasses being dragged away. Instead, there were those same massive footprints I had learned to recognize, but now they were deeper, more spaced out, suggesting running or intense effort. And there were other footprints, human ones. A feeling of dread grew inside me as I followed the signs of confrontation. The rain had made it difficult, but not impossible, to distinguish the path taken. The forest people's footprints led in one direction, deeper into the forest, while the human ones seemed to retreat toward what I presumed was an access point to some road or trail. Driven by a concern that wasn't entirely scientific, but more personal, I chose to follow the forest people's footprints. The rain began to fall harder, soaking through my waterproof jacket and making visibility increasingly difficult. The forest had taken on an almost oppressive quality, the sounds of rain drowning out any other natural noise. Still, I continued, guided by a sense of foreboding I couldn't ignore. After about half a mile following these increasingly difficult to distinguish tracks, the signs changed. There was less chaos, more purpose to the marks left behind. The footprints now followed a more direct path, with fewer signs of urgency. And then I noticed something that made my heart race. A trail of small, dark red droplets, almost invisible in the mud, except where they stained an occasional leaf or stone. Blood. And by the way it mixed with the footprints, it belonged to one of the forest people. The trail led me to an area of the forest I had never explored before. Here, the trees grew more densely, forming an almost impenetrable canopy that left the ground below in perpetual twilight. But it wasn't the darkness that made me stop abruptly. It was the smell. That same musky odor I had noticed during my encounter, but now stronger, mixed with something metallic and pungent that I recognized instantly, the unmistakable aroma of decomposing flesh. I moved forward more slowly now, all my senses on high alert. The sound of rain diminished somewhat under the thick canopy, allowing me to hear better. And that's when I heard them, soft, almost rhythmic sounds, like stone rubbing against stone, interspersed with what seemed to be heavy breathing. I skirted around a particularly dense cluster of trees and froze. Before me was a small clearing, not natural, but formed by the fall of an ancient tree that had created an opening in the canopy. And at the center of this clearing was a sight that defied everything I thought I knew about these creatures. 3 figures, the male I had met, the female, and a third, larger and grayer individual I had never seen before, were crouched in a semicircle. Between them, laid out on the moss-covered ground, was a body, a human body. My first instinct was to retreat, to flee. All the horror stories about Bigfoot, all the sensationalist accounts of attacks and abductions that I had dismissed as fantasy flooded my mind. But then I realized what was actually happening, and the reality was far stranger and more profound than any legend. They weren't consuming the body, as my momentary fear had suggested. They were tending to it. The older male was applying some kind of green paste, presumably some mashed plant or fungus, to a wound in the body's side. The female was arranging what appeared to be a bed of moss beneath the head, and the male I knew was using a stone as a tool, not to cause harm, but apparently to grind something, roots or herbs, in a small pool of water in a stone depression. I moved forward involuntarily, fascinated by this surreal scene. That's when a twig snapped under my foot, and 3 pairs of eyes turned in my direction. What happened next still astonishes me. Instead of aggression, I saw recognition in the younger male's eyes. He made a soft sound, almost like a questioning grunt, and made a motion with his hand that seemed to indicate I could approach. The other 2 seemed more cautious, but not hostile. I moved forward slowly, keeping my hands visible, trying to project calmness and respect. When I got closer, I could finally see the body on the ground clearly. It was a man, probably in his 50s, dressed in what had once been hunting gear, now blood-stained and torn. His face was pale, and this shocked me, he was breathing. Weak, irregular, but alive. What I was witnessing was not a hunt or a ritual with prey. It was a rescue. The pieces began to fall into place in my mind. The confrontation site I had found earlier, probably where this man, a hunter, had encountered and possibly attacked one of the forest people. But instead of killing him in retaliation, they had brought him here to help him, to heal him. I knelt beside the body, quickly checking his vital signs as my first aid training allowed. Weak pulse, shallow breathing, a severe wound in the leg that seemed to be the source of most of the blood, but which had been carefully covered with that green paste. He was in shock and needed professional medical attention, but without the intervention of these creatures, he would certainly have been dead already. I looked at the male I had met, trying to communicate with my eyes and expression what needed to be done. I pointed to the injured man, then to myself, and then made a gesture in the direction I knew led back to civilization. The creature held my gaze for a long moment, and then nodded, a gesture so human that it almost took my breath away. What followed was a coordinated effort I never would have thought possible. The older male and the female backed away, while the younger male helped me improvise a stretcher using strong branches and my own jacket. Carefully, we placed the injured man on it. Before we departed, the younger male placed a small packet made of folded leaves next to the injured man. More of the medicinal paste, I presumed. The journey back was arduous. The rain continued, and the weight of the man made it difficult to navigate the uneven terrain of the forest. But the most extraordinary thing was that the male forest person accompanied me for almost half a mile, occasionally helping when the path became particularly difficult, before stopping at what seemed to be an invisible boundary. He made a soft sound, briefly touched my shoulder with a gentleness surprising for hands so large, and then disappeared into the forest as silently as he had appeared in my life months before. I managed to get the injured man to the nearest road, where fortunately I found signal for my cell phone and called an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, I told an edited version of the truth, that I had found the wounded man during my wildlife research and brought him out of the forest. They were more focused on stabilizing the patient than questioning my story, and soon they took him away, leaving me alone in the rain, soaked, exhausted, and profoundly shaken by what I had witnessed. In the weeks that followed, I did what I could to find out what happened to the rescued hunter. Eventually, I discovered that he had survived, though he was still hospitalized with secondary infections from the leg wound. Through careful conversations with local forest rangers, I gathered fragments of his story. He was indeed a hunter, operating illegally in the protected area, who had encountered something he shouldn't have, according to his delirious words to first responders. No one took this seriously, of course, attributing it to blood loss and trauma. Meanwhile, I returned several times to the area where the rescue had taken place, but found no more signs of the forest people. It was as if they had moved on. Perhaps uncomfortable with the closeness of human encounter, or perhaps following some seasonal migration pattern I didn't yet understand. It was only 3 months later, in January 2020, that I had another contact. Not a direct encounter, but something equally significant. During a particularly cold expedition, I found a small pile of objects carefully arranged on a tree stump. Some nuts, some dried winter berries, and more surprising, a small object wrapped in leaves that, when unwrapped, revealed itself to be a leather wallet. The wallet belonged to the injured hunter, containing his ID and some credit cards, but no cash. I was perplexed at first, until I realized what this meant. The forest people had retrieved the wallet, probably from the initial confrontation site, and were returning it, not for its material value, but because they understood its significance to humans. It was a gesture of reconciliation, of understanding, and perhaps most importantly, of communication. This incident, the rescue of the hunter and the return of his wallet, was just the beginning of a series of increasingly extraordinary discoveries about these creatures' behavior toward humans, discoveries that would culminate, eventually, in the most shocking revelation: what actually happens to human bodies when they are found by the forest people? That revelation came in the summer of 2020, already a strange period with the world facing the global pandemic. The forests had become even more isolated, with tourism reduced and patrol activities limited. I had obtained special permission to continue my official research, now reinvented as a study of the impact of reduced human activity on local wildlife. My encounters with the forest people had become more regular, though still unpredictable. There seemed to be an understanding between us. I respected their space, never tried to follow them beyond where they allowed me, never brought recording equipment or other humans. In return, they occasionally allowed me glimpses of their life, how they crafted simple tools, how they communicated through a complex language of gestures and vocalizations, how they taught their young to identify medicinal plants and food sources. That summer had been particularly dry, increasing the risk of forest fires. On a hot August afternoon, I was following what I believed were recent signs of passage when I noticed a change in the behavior of birds ahead of me, suddenly silent, then agitated. Something was disturbing the natural rhythm of the forest. I moved forward cautiously, all senses alert. The smell hit me first. That unmistakable mixture of decomposition and copper that can only mean one thing: death. The source wasn't hard to locate. In a small depression between two large moss-covered rocks lay a human body. It was a man, apparently in his 30s, wearing hiking gear. His body was in the early stages of decomposition, suggesting he had died a few days earlier. There were no obvious signs of violent trauma, no bullet wounds, no deep lacerations. In fact, he looked almost serene, as if he had simply sat down to rest and never got up again. My training told me to contact authorities immediately. This was a case for forest rangers, police, medical examiners, not for a biologist specializing in primates. But as I reached for my phone, I noticed something strange about the arrangement of the scene. The body was lying on a meticulously prepared bed of ferns and soft moss. The hands were crossed over the chest, a position a body in rigor mortis would not naturally assume. And most notably, around the body, in a perfect circle, were small piles of objects: wildflowers, some still fresh, small quartz crystals, bright red berries, a perfectly intact eagle feather, a cedar branch. I moved closer, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. There was intentional organization here, purpose. This wasn't just a place where someone had died, it was a place where someone had been cared for after death. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. That now familiar sensation of being watched traveled up my spine. I turned slowly and saw the older male I had encountered during the hunter's rescue months before. He was about 50 feet away, partially hidden by a massive tree, but not making any real attempt to conceal himself. It was as if he was waiting for me to notice him. Our eyes met, and he made a gesture I had never seen before. Both hands open, palms up, raised slightly, and then lowered in a fluid movement. Then he moved to the side, clearly indicating I should follow him. I hesitated, looking back at the body. My duty as a citizen was clear: report this immediately. But my instinct as a scientist, as someone who had gained a glimpse of something extraordinary, urged me to follow that creature. After a moment of internal conflict, I chose to follow, promising myself I would return and do the right thing afterward. The older male guided me for about 20 minutes, moving at a pace I could comfortably maintain. Gradually, the forest around us began to change. The trees here were older, more massive, their trunks twisted and gnarled in a way that suggested centuries, perhaps millennia of slow growth. The ground was softer, each step sinking slightly into a thick layer of decomposing organic material. Even the air felt different, richer, laden with moisture, and the aroma of ancient vegetation. Finally, we reached an area that left me speechless. It was a small, natural clearing where an opening in the canopy allowed direct sunlight to touch the forest floor. At the center of the clearing was a structure that defied immediate explanation. Not a building in the modern human sense, but clearly something created with purpose and planning. It was a kind of monument, composed of stones stacked in a configuration that seemed vaguely pyramidal, surrounded by a circle of logs placed vertically in the ground. Around this central monument were small piles of objects, similar to those I'd seen around the body, but in greater number and variety. Flowers, crystals, polished bones of small animals, feathers, shells that must have been brought from far away, considering the distance to the ocean. But what really captured my attention, what made me freeze in awe and reverence, were the skulls. Carefully arranged in niches within the stone structure were about a dozen human skulls, some obviously very old, others in better states of preservation. My primate companion moved to the structure and gently touched one of the stones, then looked at me. The meaning was unmistakable. This is important. This is sacred. What I was witnessing went far beyond mere animal behaviors, beyond even tool use or complex communication. I was witnessing something that science had reserved exclusively for humans: spiritual culture, funeral ritual, a concept of afterlife, or at least a reverence for the dead. As I approached the structure, I noticed more details. Some of the skulls were decorated with patterns of red ochre, simple but deliberate symbols, lines and dots that suggested some kind of meaning. On some of the newer skulls, small personal items were placed alongside: a wedding ring, a necklace with a crucifix, a wristwatch. Significant belongings of those who had passed, preserved as part of the memory. I looked at my guide, full of questions I knew I couldn't articulate in a way he would fully comprehend. He seemed to understand my confusion and did something surprising. He extended his massive hand and, with astonishing gentleness, grasped my wrist. Then, slowly, he guided my hand to touch one of the stones of the structure. The stone was surprisingly warm to the touch, having absorbed the heat from the sun that entered through the opening in the canopy. Under my fingers, I felt small grooves, deliberate etchings in the hard surface. When I looked closer, I saw they were symbols, similar but distinct from those on the skulls. A written language? Ritual markings? There was no way to know for certain. In that moment, a profound understanding hit me. The body I had found, carefully arranged and surrounded by offerings, it wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a pattern, a tradition. The forest people didn't just avoid humans or occasionally interact with them. They honored us in death. For centuries, perhaps millennia, while humans told terrifying stories about wild creatures that kidnapped and devoured people, these creatures were actually performing acts of deep respect. When they found humans who had died in the forest, from exposure, accidents, age, or illness, they didn't see them as prey or threats. They saw them as fallen brothers, worthy of ritual and reverence. The older male began to emit soft sounds, almost like chanting, while making fluid gestures with his hands. It was obviously some kind of ritual, something he was sharing with me not as a research subject to a scientist, but as a teacher to a student, a priest to a novice. I stood there for almost 2 hours, while he, eventually joined by the female and the younger male I knew, performed what I can only describe as a ceremony. They used vocal sounds, rhythmic body movements, and occasionally touched or rearranged the offerings around the monument. At one point, the younger male offered me some berries, which I accepted and ate, instinctively understanding that I was participating in something like a communion. When the ceremony ended, the older male made a gesture that I interpreted as a question, pointing to me and then to the path back, essentially asking if I understood what I should do now. I nodded, hoping to convey that yes, I understood what they wanted me to do with the body I had found. I returned to the location where the body was. Now, with new understanding, I saw the arrangements of offerings in a different light. This wasn't just a site of accidental death, it was a place of honor, of transition. The forest people had found this deceased man and, rather than ignoring or fearing him, had performed their rites, preparing him for whatever they believed came after death. I took out my phone and did what any responsible person would do. I reported the discovery to the proper authorities. When the forest rangers and police arrived, I gave my statement, omitting any mention of the forest people. I simply said I was conducting research when I found the body, apparently a hiker who had suffered some kind of medical failure. The authorities noticed, of course, the strange arrangement of the body and the objects around it. I heard them speculate about pagan rituals or insensitive vandals. I said nothing to correct these misguided assumptions. Some truths are too heavy to be shared. The months that followed were a time of deep reflection and additional research. With this new understanding, I began to re-examine historical accounts of Bigfoot abductions and mysterious disappearances in remote forest areas. In many cases, when bodies were eventually found, there were reports of strange arrangements or inexplicable objects found with the remains. Perceptions of desecration or cannibalism often came from human observers misinterpreting what they were seeing through their own lenses of fear and misunderstanding. In one particularly notable case from 1978, forest rangers in Northern California had found the remains of a lost hunter surrounded by a circle of stones and flowers. The official reports attributed this to prankster campers or possibly cult rituals. Now I knew better. But the deeper knowledge, the discovery that really challenged my understanding of what these creatures are, came in the winter of 2021. Winter in that region is relentless. Constant rain, near-freezing temperatures, and occasionally snow. For most researchers, it's a time to analyze data and write, not for fieldwork. But I knew that the adverse conditions offered unique opportunities. Fewer humans in the forests meant the forest people might move more freely, perhaps even into areas they would normally avoid. On a particularly cold January morning, I followed what I believed were recent signs: branches broken in characteristic ways, some partial footprints preserved in patches of semi-frozen mud. The forest was silent, most birds having migrated, many mammals in hibernation or reduced activity. That's when I heard the sounds. Not typical forest sounds, but something different. Vocalizations. Not the occasional communication calls I had heard before, but something sustained, rhythmic, almost like singing. I followed the sound, moving as quietly as possible through the wet, dense vegetation. The closer I got, the clearer it became. Multiple voices in complex harmony, rising and falling in patterns that seemed deliberately structured. Finally, I reached the source of the sound, and what I saw made my heart nearly stop. In a small natural clearing, at least 8 forest people were gathered, the largest group I had ever seen together. It included the 3 I knew, plus others of various sizes and apparent ages. They were arranged in a circle, their bodies swaying subtly in synchrony with the singing. At the center of the circle was a human body. My initial instinct of fear was quickly replaced by understanding. I wasn't witnessing something sinister, but something sacred. The body was of an elderly woman, dressed in simple hiking clothes. There were no signs of violence. In fact, her face looked peaceful, almost serene. Around her, the forest people had placed their usual offerings: winter flowers, bright mosses, small stones. But something more was happening here, something I had never witnessed before. This wasn't just a body they had found and honored. This was an active ceremony, a funeral in progress. As I watched, fascinated, I saw that each member of the group occasionally approached the body, gently touched it, and then made a specific gesture. Open hands raised toward the sky and then lowered again. After this, they would place a small personal item with the body, an especially beautiful nut, a feather, a polished small stone. The singing continued for almost an hour, changing in tone and intensity, sometimes with an individual taking what seemed to be a leader's role while the others responded. It was complex, deliberate, and unmistakably spiritual. When the ceremony came to an end, the group began to carefully cover the body with moss, leaves, and small branches, not carelessly, but with meticulous precision, like a burial without soil, preserving the body within a cocoon of forest material. That's when one of them, not one I knew, but an older female with graying hair around her face, looked directly to where I was hidden. For a freezing moment, I thought I would be driven away, perhaps even attacked for interrupting such an intimate moment. Instead, she made a calm gesture, inviting me to approach. I moved forward hesitantly, feeling like an intruder, a profane entering hallowed ground. The other members of the group noticed me, some showing signs of alarm, others curiosity. The male I knew best made a soft sound, apparently reassuring the others. The older female approached me. She was smaller than the males, but still massive compared to humans. Her gait slightly stooped with age, but still dignified. She extended her hand, not to touch me, but holding something. When she opened her fingers, I saw a small shining metal object, a simple wedding band. She pointed to the now almost completely covered body, then to the ring, and finally to me. The message was clear. Take this back to her people. Find who she belonged to. Tell them she didn't die alone or afraid, but honored. I accepted the ring with a solemn nod. The older female touched my arm briefly, the first direct physical contact any of them had initiated with me, and then returned to her group. One by one, they began to move away, silently slipping between the trees until only the male I knew best remained. He gazed at me for a long moment, something undecipherable in his ancient eyes. Then he made a gesture I will never forget. He touched his forehead, his heart, and then pointed to me, repeating the same pattern. A connection, an acknowledgement, a bond between species that had existed side by side for thousands of years, rarely in harmony, often in fear, but always, somehow, aware of each other. In the weeks that followed, I did what I had promised. Using the ring and a discreet search of missing persons reports in the area, I managed to identify the woman, a 78-year-old widow who had gone out for a solitary hike and never returned. I concocted a story about finding the ring during my research and returned it to her grateful children, along with a carefully edited message. She found peace in the forest. The truth, the full truth about what the forest people do with our dead is something few would believe. In human mythology, we've turned these creatures into monsters, into predators that hunt and devour. The reality is almost the perfect opposite. They are caretakers, priests of a sort of forest religion that sees humans not as enemies or prey, but as separated relatives who, in death, deserve honor and ritual. The bodies they find, lost hikers, solitary hunters, unhappy souls seeking ending, are treated with the respect many human cultures would recognize. They are prepared, honored with offerings, sung to in their passage, and finally returned to the earth or preserved in places they consider sacred. And what about the living? What do they do with humans they encounter still breathing in their domain? Here, the answer is more complex and varies depending on circumstances. Those who represent danger, armed hunters for example, are generally avoided, sometimes frightened away with displays of size or intimidating sounds. Those who are injured or lost are often helped discreetly, subtle signs directing to trails, food left where it can be found, and in rare cases like the hunter I helped rescue, direct intervention. But most often, they simply watch us. They observe our loud, unaware species stumble through the forests, taking pictures, leaving trash, talking loudly, never really seeing the world around us. They study us as we would study them, if we believed they existed. Today, 3 years after that first video sighting that changed my life, I continue my work in the forest. My official research on wildlife movement patterns produces legitimate enough academic papers to maintain my funding. But my real work, my true purpose, has become something different. I have become a kind of intermediary, an unofficial diplomat between two species that share a planet but rarely understand each other. When I find signs of funeral rituals, I discreetly notify authorities about the location of remains, inventing plausible explanations. When hikers report sightings or strange sounds, I offer reassuring explanations about bears or elk. And occasionally, when the forest people allow me to, I participate in their rituals, learning more about their complex spirituality, their understanding of the world, their view of humans not as separate from nature, but as part of it, a part often lost, confused, but still worthy of compassion. I know that someday I will need to share this truth more broadly. The records I keep, detailed notes, drawings, a few videos and photographs taken with tacit permission will eventually find their way to the world, but not while they are still vulnerable, still few in number, still at risk from our curiosity, fear, and greed. For now, I carry with me the knowledge of what really happens when we die alone in the forest. We aren't devoured by monsters or left to the elements. We are found by ancient relatives who still remember when we were part of the same world. We are carefully prepared, celebrated with songs whose melodies our modern ears can barely recognize, and return to the earth with dignity. What does Bigfoot really do with human bodies? It honors them. It mourns them. It reminds us of our connection to a wild world from which we've long separated ourselves, but which still recognizes us as part of itself. And perhaps, if we learn to listen to the forest as I've learned, we might eventually return that respect. Perhaps we can recognize these creatures not as monsters from campfire tales, but as the complex, conscious, and deeply spiritual beings they are. Perhaps we can finally understand that in the great cycle of life and death that connects all things, we are never truly alone, even in the most remote and dark places of the forest. Or perhaps not. Perhaps some secrets should remain secrets, some truths remain untold. Perhaps the best I can hope is that someone, someday, finds these words and knows that there are more mysteries in the natural world than our science has ever admitted, and that not all the monsters in our stories are truly monstrous. Meanwhile, I'll continue my quiet work, walking between two worlds, the human world of reason, science, and documentation, and the older world of the forest, where creatures that shouldn't exist perform rituals older than our civilization to honor those who have lost themselves beneath the ancient trees. And when my own time comes, when my own body is found under the green shadows, I hope it will be they who find me first. That they will take me to their sacred monument, that they will sing their ancient songs over me, and that they will return me to the forest that has become my true home. Because now I know the truth about what Bigfoot does with human bodies, and it is more beautiful, more profound, and more sacred than any of us ever imagined.